My stepmom kept a 15-year spreadsheet of everything she spent on me, then demanded I pay her back every cent. She showed up with a lawyer, but right. As she was explaining everything, her doorbell rang. She opened the door, went pale, and has never been the same since. My real mom died from cancer when I was 7. Then my dad remarried Bertha when I was 10. From day one, she had this insane system where I had to earn affection like I was some employee. She made a chart on our fridge called Jake's Investment Tracker, where I got points for grades and chores that I could cash in for basic stuff like watching TV or getting hugs. Dad just sat there scrolling his phone while she explained the rules, never once saying it was insane. When I broke my arm at 11, Bertha asked the doctor if it would affect my typing speed because she'd enrolled me in coding classes. Not "Are you okay? But will this impact your earning potential?" Meanwhile, Dad was glued to his phone, barely looking up. Middle school was hell because she made me quit basketball to focus on profitable skills, while Dad would slip me 20s like that made up for letting her control my life. When my first girlfriend dumped me at 15, I was devastated, but Bertha ignored me for 3 months until SAT prep started. She called me her little ATM in front of her book club, and Dad would laugh along. One Mother's Day, I was crying, missing my real mom, and Bertha said tears don't pay bills while Dad stared at his phone. Senior year, when everyone went to prom, she made me attend coding boot camp, and Dad said it was for the best. The kicker is when I turned 18, I found out Mom left life insurance for my education, but Bertha convinced Dad to use it for family expenses, meaning her credit card debt. Fast forward to now, I'm 25, working as a senior engineer, making over $200,000, and suddenly they're super interested in my life. Bertha became Mother of the Year, calling daily, while Dad started inviting me to lunch, always asking about stock options. Last month I got promoted to tech lead. I stupidly told them at dinner, thinking maybe we could finally be a real family. My girlfriend Maria was there when I mentioned the equity vesting schedule. I watched Bertha's face cycle through emotions before landing on greed. Bertha immediately pulled out her phone, calculating what I'd owe her, based on my new compensation, while Dad nodded along. The next dinner, Bertha lost it, showing me this spreadsheet she'd maintained for years with every penny spent on me, including opportunity costs. The total was $387,000 with compound interest, and Bertha demanded 50% return on investment, while Dad mumbled about fairness. Maria tried to defend me, but Bertha called her a gold digger and Dad agreed. Bertha said your real mother left you nothing but medical debt while I built you into a success story. That night, I found my mom's hidden letter full of unconditional love and realized I'd been living with monsters. The next day, Bertha showed up with her lawyer brother and contracts demanding I sign acknowledgement of my debt. Dad was there too, constantly checking his phone, looking nervous. Bertha had itemized everything, including emotional labor at $50 an hour, and I felt my hands shaking as I reached for the pen. Then the doorbell rang. Dad jumped up, but Bertha hit him to it, yanking the door open to reveal a pregnant woman with tears streaming down her face. The woman looked at my dad and said, "We need to talk about our baby and the money you promised me from Jake's earnings." Time stopped as Bertha's face transformed from confusion to rage, the papers falling from her hands. Dad stood frozen between them, mouth opening and closing. Bertha's voice built from a whisper to a scream, asking how long. The mistress said 3 years. She was clutching her belly, saying Dad told her once I started making real money, they'd finally be together and he'd leave Bertha with nothing. Bertha grabbed the contract and threw it at him, screaming about how she'd been building her retirement while he was building another family. The mistress said she wasn't the other woman, because Dad said the marriage was just a business arrangement, and Bertha launched herself at Dad. I stood there watching my two tormentors destroy each other, realizing while Bertha saw me as an investment portfolio, while Dad had been seeing me as a trust fund for his secret life. I looked at all three of them and said, "You're all sick." Later I found out Dad had been siphoning money from my college fund to support his mistress while telling Bertha it went to business expenses. And Bertha had been trying to claim me as a dependent on her taxes, even though I'd been financially independent for years. They're now in a vicious divorce battle, each trying to claim rights to my future earnings while I've cut them both off completely. The mistress keeps sending messages about how I should support my half-sibling, and Bertha sends itemized bills weekly. I got excellent lawyers who sent them all cease and desist letters. I thought that was the end until yesterday when Maria found something researching Bertha's background. She pulled up an old insurance document that made my blood run cold. My mother had a life insurance policy worth $2 million, not the $50,000 Bertha claimed. The beneficiary had been changed to Bertha's name just 2 days before my mother died, and the signature on the change form didn't match any other document with my mother's handwriting. I stared at the document Maria held, my hands trembling as I took it from her. The signature line showed a shaky scrawl that looked nothing like my mother's neat handwriting I remembered from birthday cards she'd saved for me. Maria spread out more papers across our dining table. Bank statements, medical records, insurance forms. She'd spent weeks digging through public records and making calls to old contacts at the hospital where my mother had been treated. Each document told a piece of a story I'd never known existed. The timeline made my stomach turn. Bertha had started working at the hospital 6 months before my mother's diagnosis. She'd been assigned to the oncology ward as an administrative assistant, handling paperwork and insurance claims. The dates lined up perfectly. Bertha had access to every form, every signature, every piece of my mother's medical information. I picked up a photo Maria had found from the hospital's old newsletter. There was Bertha, 15 years younger, standing with the oncology staff at a Christmas party. My mother's doctor, Dr. Nathaniel Chen, stood in the back row. Maria had tracked him down, now retired and living in Arizona. My phone buzzed. Another message from Bertha demanding payment. I ignored it and dialed the number Maria had written down. Dr. Chen answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with age. When I explained who I was, he went silent for a long moment. He remembered my mother, said she'd been responding well to treatment initially. The prognosis had been hopeful. Then suddenly, in her last 2 months, everything changed. Her medications seemed less effective. She weakened rapidly. He'd raised concerns with the hospital administration, but they dismissed it as an unfortunate turn in her illness. Dr. Chen mentioned something else. Bertha had been unusually involved in my mother's case. She'd volunteered to handle all the paperwork personally, staying late to process forms. She'd even visited my mother several times, claiming she liked to check on patients who didn't have many visitors. My father had been traveling for work frequently during that period. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. Maria pulled up Bertha's employment history. She'd left the hospital 3 months after my mother died. The timing was too perfect. She'd met my father at a grief support group, presenting herself as a caring woman who understood loss. Within a year, they were married. The next morning, I drove to the storage unit where I kept my mother's belongings. I'd never had the heart to go through everything. Box after box contained pieces of her life. In a small jewelry box, I found more letters she'd written to me, dated just weeks before her death. Her handwriting in these was still strong, still clearly hers. Nothing like the signature on the insurance change form. One letter mentioned Bertha by name. My mother wrote about the nice lady from the hospital who'd been visiting, bringing her tea and sitting with her when Dad couldn't be there. She wrote about how Bertha had offered to help with any paperwork to make things easier. My mother had been grateful for the kindness. I photographed everything and sent it to the lawyer Maria had recommended, Nathaniel Morrison, who specialized in insurance fraud. He took one look at the documents and immediately saw what we suspected. The signature on the beneficiary change was forged. The witness signatures were from 2 hospital employees who'd left shortly after, their whereabouts now unknown. Nathaniel advised me to gather more evidence before taking action. He gave me a list of what we'd need to build a case. Maria and I spent the next weeks playing detective. We found former hospital employees, tracked down old records, and slowly pieced together Bertha's pattern. She hadn't just done this once. Nathaniel discovered 2 other cases with similar patterns. Elderly patients with substantial life insurance, sudden declines in health, beneficiary changes just before death. Bertha's name appeared in the paperwork for all 3 cases. She'd been careful, spacing them out over several years, but the pattern was there. I met with the other families. The Nguyens had lost their grandmother. The Johnsons had lost their father. Both had been responding well to treatment before sudden declines. Both had beneficiary changes that enriched people who'd barely known them. The signatures on those forms were also questionable. We formed an alliance, sharing information and resources. The evidence mounted. Bertha had been running a sophisticated operation, using her position to identify vulnerable patients with valuable policies. She'd befriend them, gain their trust, and then somehow facilitate changes to their insurance beneficiaries. The investigation revealed she'd had help. A doctor who'd been dismissed for unrelated issues, a nurse who'd left under suspicious circumstances. They'd all worked together, though proving the connections was difficult. The hospital had destroyed many old records, and key witnesses had moved away or couldn't be found. Meanwhile, Bertha's demands for money grew more aggressive. She showed up at my work, causing a scene in the lobby until security removed her. She called Maria's parents, spinning tales about how I'd abandoned the woman who'd raised me. She posted on social media about ungrateful children, though she was careful never to mention the specific financial demands. Dad's mistress, Alexandra, reached out to me. She was 8 months pregnant and desperate. Dad had been promising her money that didn't exist, stringing her along with tales of my future earnings. She'd left her job and apartment based on his promises. Now she was facing single motherhood with no support. I met Alexandra at a coffee shop. She looked exhausted, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She told me Dad had painted himself as a victim, trapped in a loveless marriage with Bertha, waiting for me to succeed so he could finally be free. He'd shown her spreadsheets of my projected earnings, promised her a percentage once I started sharing with the family. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Bertha had been scheming to claim my mother's insurance money, Dad had been scheming to claim my future earnings for his secret family. Both had seen me as nothing more than a financial asset to be exploited. Alexandra had saved all of Dad's messages, years of promises, financial projections, and plans for their future together. He'd been siphoning money not just from my college fund, but from Bertha's carefully hoarded savings too. He'd opened credit cards in her name, taken loans against their house. While Bertha thought she was building her retirement on my back, Dad was spending it on his double life. I gave Alexandra the contact information for a good family lawyer. Whatever Dad had done, the baby was innocent. She needed help I couldn't provide, but I could at least point her toward resources. She left with tears in her eyes, finally understanding the man she trusted had been lying to everyone. That night, Bertha's brother, the lawyer, sent a formal demand letter. It claimed I owed Bertha not just for my upbringing, but for opportunities provided and career guidance. The amount had grown to $450,000. He threatened to file a lawsuit if I didn't respond within 10 days. Nathaniel laughed when he read it. The claims were baseless, he assured me. No court would uphold a parent's demand for repayment of basic child-rearing expenses, but the letter gave us an opportunity. If Bertha wanted to involve the legal system, we could use discovery to dig deeper into her past. I authorized Nathaniel to respond. His letter was a masterpiece of legal language that essentially said, "Bring it on," while hinting at what we'd uncovered about the insurance fraud. He requested any documentation Bertha had regarding my mother's insurance policy as part of our defense preparation. Bertha's reaction was immediate. She called me screaming about betrayal and threats. I recorded the call on Nathaniel's advice. She admitted to changing the beneficiary, for my own good, because my mother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. She claimed it was what my mother would have wanted, that the money had gone to raising me properly. But the numbers didn't add up. $2 million, even after taxes, was far more than Bertha had spent on my upbringing. Where had the rest gone? Her lifestyle had certainly improved after marrying Dad, but not by that much. We started looking into her financial history more carefully. Maria discovered Bertha had a gambling problem. Years of casino visits, online poker accounts, sports betting apps. She'd been careful to hide it from Dad, using separate bank accounts and credit cards. But the paper trail was there. The insurance money had funded her addiction for years. We also found evidence of Bertha's other schemes. She'd convinced several elderly neighbors to name her in their wills, promising to care for their pets or maintain their graves. She'd started a charity for cancer patients that seemed to exist only on paper, collecting donations that disappeared into her personal accounts. The pattern of exploitation extended far beyond my family. Dad, meanwhile, was spiraling. With Bertha freezing their joint accounts and Alexandra demanding support, he was desperate. He showed up at my apartment at midnight, hammered and crying. He blamed Bertha for everything, claimed she'd corrupted him, forced him into the affair. He begged for money, just enough to get by until the divorce was settled. I didn't let him in. Through the door, I told him about the investigation into Bertha. His face went pale. He'd known about the insurance money, he admitted. Bertha had told him she'd handled everything with my mother's estate. He'd been happy to benefit from it without asking questions. Now he realized he might be implicated too. The next day, Dad's lawyer contacted Nathaniel. Dad wanted to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He had documents, he claimed. Records Bertha didn't know he'd kept. He'd been suspicious of her for years, but stayed quiet because of the comfortable life her schemes provided. We We met in Nathaniel's office. Dad looked terrible, unshaven and hollow-eyed. He'd brought a box of papers he'd hidden in his office, bank statements showing large cash deposits after each of Bertha's windfalls, notes about the elderly neighbors who died leaving her money, even a recording he'd made of Bertha bragging about how easy it was to manipulate grieving families. The evidence was damning, but Dad wasn't innocent. He'd been complicit, benefiting from Bertha's crimes while maintaining plausible deniability. Nathaniel made no promises about immunity. That would be up to prosecutors if criminal charges were filed. As we built our case, Bertha grew more desperate. She tried to empty their joint accounts, but the divorce proceedings had frozen them. She attempted to sell their house, but needed Dad's signature. Her brother stopped representing her when he realized the extent of her legal troubles. She was trapped, watching her carefully constructed life crumble. Then came the breakthrough. One of the witness signatures on my mother's insurance form belonged to a nurse named Ailey Chen, Dr. Nathaniel Chen's daughter. She'd been young, just out of nursing school, when Bertha had convinced her to witness the forged document. The guilt had eaten at her for years. Ailey agreed to testify. She revealed how Bertha had pressured her, threatening her job if she didn't cooperate. Bertha had claimed my mother had verbally agreed to the change, but was too weak to sign properly. Ailey had been naive, wanting to help, not realizing she was participating in fraud. With Ailey's testimony, the case against Bertha solidified. Nathaniel contacted the district attorney's office. Insurance fraud, forgery, elder abuse. The charges would be serious. The other families we'd found wanted justice too. Bertha's pattern of exploitation was finally being exposed. The day before Bertha was arrested, she made one last attempt to manipulate me. She showed up at Maria's apartment while I was there, looking haggard and desperate. She tried everything. Tears, threats, appeals to family loyalty. She even claimed my mother had wanted her to have the money, that they'd become close in those final weeks. I asked her one question. Did you call my mother? The silence stretched between us. Bertha's face cycled through emotions. Shock, calculation, defiance. Finally, she said, I helped her suffering end sooner. She was in pain. The money was just practical. Maria had been recording on her phone. Bertha's confession, vague as it was, added another dimension to the investigation. We turned the recording over to Nathaniel, who brought it to the prosecutors. The investigation expanded to include possible murder charges. Bertha was arrested the next morning. The news coverage was extensive but local. No national media sensation, just a sad story of greed and betrayal. Dad wasn't charged, but his reputation was destroyed. Alexandra had her baby, a little girl she named Sarah. Despite everything, I set up a small trust fund for my half-sister. She didn't choose her parents. The legal proceedings took months. Other victims came forward. Bertha's gambling debts were staggering. She'd been one loss away from bankruptcy when she targeted my mother's insurance policy. The other schemes had been attempts to maintain her lifestyle and feed her addiction. In the end, Bertha was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and forgery. The murder investigation continued, but proving she'd hastened my mother's death was difficult after so many years. She received 15 years in prison, though she'd be eligible for parole in 7. The insurance company agreed to pay out my mother's policy to me, the rightful beneficiary. After legal fees and setting aside money for Sarah's trust, I donated much of it to legitimate cancer research in my mother's name. It felt like the right thing to do. Dad disappeared after the trial. Last I heard, he was living with his brother in another state, working construction. Alexandra moved on, focusing on raising Sarah. She sends me pictures sometimes. Sarah has my mother's eyes. Maria and I got married last spring. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and her family. We've built a life based on honesty and trust, the opposite of what I grew up with. We're expecting our first child in December. I still work in tech, but I've found balance. Success isn't about earning potential or being someone's investment. It's about building genuine connections and contributing something meaningful to the world. My mother knew that. Her letters remind me every day. Sometimes I think about the chart on the refrigerator, Jake's investment tracker. Bertha saw me as a financial instrument to be optimized. Dad saw me as a resource to be exploited. Neither of them saw me as a person worthy of unconditional love. But my mother did. Even in her final weeks, possibly being poisoned by someone she trusted, she wrote letters filled with love and hope for my future. She didn't care what I'd earn or achieve. She just wanted me to be happy and kind. That's the real inheritance she left me. Not money, but the knowledge that I was loved for who I am, not what I could provide. It took years of manipulation and lies to understand that truth, but now I hold on to it tightly. The other day, I was cleaning out old boxes and found the original chart Bertha had made. All those points and rewards, reducing childhood to a transaction. I burned it in our fireplace, watching the twisted system turn to ash. Maria held my hand as we watched it disappear. Bertha writes me letters from prison sometimes. I don't read them. Dad sends birthday cards with no return address. I throw those away too. The only letters I keep are from my mother, yellowed with age but still full of love. As for the money, it's mostly gone now. Donated, invested in Sarah's future, used to help other families Bertha had targeted. It feels right. My mother's final gift wasn't supposed to be about money anyway. It was about love, and that's something Bertha could never steal, no matter how hard she tried. I work normal hours now. Maria and I cook dinner together. We're painting the nursery soft yellow, the color my mother loved. On weekends, we visit her grave, bringing fresh flowers and updates about our life. I tell her about the baby coming, about the home we're building on a foundation of love, not transactions. The investigation revealed Bertha had targeted 7 families total over her years at the hospital. Most of the victims were already gone, but their families finally got answers. We stay in touch, a strange support group bonded by shared betrayal. We're working with the hospital to implement better oversight, ensuring no one else falls victim to similar schemes. Last week, I got promoted again. This time, I didn't tell anyone except Maria. My success is mine to share or keep private. No one tracks my earnings on a refrigerator chart. No one calculates my worth based on my salary. I'm free from the transactional love that nearly destroyed me. The baby kicks when Maria plays music. We've picked out names. Thomas for a boy, after Maria's grandfather, and Eleanor for a girl, after my mother. Either way, they'll grow up knowing they're loved for exactly who they are, no points required, no investment expected in return. That's the cycle I'm breaking. The chart is gone, the manipulators are facing consequences, and love in our house is freely given. My mother would be proud. In the end, her love won over Bertha's greed. It just took 15 years and a forged signature to prove it. Maria placed the document back on the table, her fingers lingering on the edges. The weight of what we'd discovered hung between us like a physical presence. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Bertha demanding her investment returns. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was still trying to collect while sitting in a cell awaiting trial. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 50s stood at our door, clutching a worn folder. She introduced herself as Patricia Nguyen, one of the families we'd connected with during the investigation. Her grandmother had been one of Bertha's victims. Patricia's hands shook as she handed me the folder. Inside were photocopies of medical records from her grandmother's final days. The parallels to my mother's case were chilling. Sudden medication changes, unexplained symptoms, and Bertha's name appearing repeatedly in visitor logs. Patricia had done her own investigation after learning about our case. She found something we'd missed. Her grandmother had kept a diary. In the final entries, she'd written about the kind hospital worker who brought her special tea every afternoon. The tea that made her drowsy but helped with the pain, Bertha had said. Patricia's voice cracked as she read the entries aloud. Her grandmother had trusted Bertha completely. We brought this new evidence to Nathaniel. He immediately saw the implications. If Bertha had been drugging patients to hasten their deaths, this went beyond fraud. This was serial murder. He contacted the prosecutor's office to expand the investigation. They would need to exhume bodies, run toxicology tests, interview more hospital staff. Meanwhile, Dad's situation grew more desperate. With his assets frozen and Alexandra pursuing child support, he'd been evicted from his apartment. He started showing up at my office building, not to confront me, but to beg. Security had to escort him out multiple times. Each time he looked worse, thinner, more disheveled, more broken. One afternoon, he cornered me in the parking garage. His desperation had morphed into something darker. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so frail. He hissed that I owed him, that he'd given me life, that Bertha's schemes had paid for my education. His breath smelled of cheap alcohol and despair. I pulled free and told him to get help. He laughed bitterly, saying help cost money he didn't have thanks to me. As I drove away, I saw him in my rearview mirror, standing alone in the empty garage. Part of me felt pity, but mostly I felt relief to be away from him. The investigation into Bertha's activities at the hospital deepened. More families came forward with similar stories. The FBI got involved when it became clear this crossed state lines. Some of Bertha's victims had family in other states who'd been cut out of inheritances. What had started as a personal betrayal was revealing itself as something much larger. Maria threw herself into research, creating detailed timelines and cross-referencing patient records. She discovered Bertha had specifically targeted patients with no close family nearby, those whose distant relatives wouldn't ask too many questions about sudden health declines or changed beneficiaries. The calculation behind it was sociopathic. Then came another shock. Ailey Chen called me directly, bypassing the lawyers. She needed to tell me something she'd held back. Bertha hadn't worked alone at the hospital. There had been another administrative assistant, someone who'd left shortly after my mother died. This woman, Bethany Morris, had been Bertha's mentor in the scheme. Ailey gave me Bethany's last known address. She'd moved to a small town 2 hours away, living quietly under her maiden name. Maria and I debated whether to contact her ourselves or let the authorities handle it. In the end, curiosity won. We drove out on a Saturday morning. Bethany's house was modest, well-kept but unremarkable. When she answered the door and saw my face, she knew immediately who I was. I had my mother's eyes, she said. She invited us in without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting 15 years for this moment. Her living room was sparse, almost monastic. She served us tea with shaking hands and began talking without prompting. She'd trained Bertha, she admitted, taught her how to identify vulnerable patients, how to gain their trust, how to forge signatures convincingly. But Bertha had taken it further than Bethany ever intended. Bethany had only wanted money. Bertha had wanted control. Where Bethany would wait for nature to take its course, Bertha grew impatient. Bethany suspected Bertha had started hastening deaths, but had been too afraid to confront her. When my mother died, Bethany saw the signs and fled, terrified of what Bertha had become. She'd kept evidence, though. Insurance forms, medical records, even recordings of conversations with Bertha. She'd held onto them as insurance of her own, protection in case Bertha ever tried to implicate her. Now, faced with my mother's son, she handed it all over. The guilt had been eating at her for years. We left with boxes of evidence. Bethany promised to testify if needed. As we drove home, Maria and I sat in heavy silence. The scope of Bertha's crimes kept expanding. How many families had she destroyed? How many final moments had she stolen? That night, we got a call from Nathaniel. Bertha wanted to make a deal. She'd provide full details of her operation, including names of others involved, in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor was considering it. They needed our input as the primary victims. The thought of Bertha getting any leniency made me sick, but Nathaniel pointed out that her cooperation could help dozens of families get closure. It could also lead to systemic changes preventing future schemes. We had to think beyond our own pain. I asked for time to consider. That night, I found myself reading my mother's letters again. One line stood out. Always choose kindness, even when it's hard. Would she want me to allow Bertha this deal if it helped others? I struggled with the decision. The next day brought a new crisis. Alexandra had been rushed to the hospital with complications from stress. The baby was fine, but she needed immediate care she couldn't afford. Despite everything, I couldn't let my half-sister suffer for her parents' choices. I covered the medical bills, setting up a proper support system for them both. Dad found out about my help to Alexandra. It sparked something in him. Not gratitude, but rage. He called me, screaming that I'd help his mistress, but not him. He threatened to go to the media, to paint me as a heartless son who'd destroyed his family. The man who'd barely looked up from his phone during my childhood now wanted to play the victim publicly. His threats were empty, though. No reporter would sympathize with a man who cheated on his wife while she committed fraud and murder. Still, his calls became increasingly erratic. He'd swing between threats and sobs, between blaming Bertha and blaming me. I eventually blocked his number, but he found other ways to reach out. The stress was affecting Maria too. She'd been strong throughout everything, but I could see the toll it was taking. She'd wake up from nightmares about Bertha coming after our future children. She'd triple-check our locks, install security cameras, research protection orders. The woman who destroyed my family was now haunting mine. We decided to take a brief trip, just to breathe. We drove to the coast, stayed in a small bed and breakfast, tried to pretend we were just a normal couple expecting their first child. For 2 days, we didn't talk about Bertha or insurance fraud or murdered patients. We walked on the beach and planned our nursery and felt almost normal. Reality intruded on our last day. Nathaniel called with urgent news. The toxicology results had come back on 2 exhumed bodies. Both showed traces of medications that shouldn't have been in their systems, substances that would have accelerated their decline while mimicking natural disease progression. Bertha hadn't just stolen from the dying, she'd been actively culling them. The charges against Bertha multiplied. First-degree murder, multiple counts. The deal was off the table. She'd spend the rest of her life in prison if convicted. Part of me felt relief, part of me felt hollow. Justice wouldn't bring my mother back. It wouldn't undo the years of manipulation. We returned home to find our front door slightly open. My heart raced as I pushed Maria behind me and entered carefully. The house had been searched, not ransacked, but clearly disturbed. Things were slightly out of place, drawers not quite closed, papers shuffled. Nothing was missing, but someone had been looking for something. The security footage showed a woman we didn't recognize. She'd picked our lock with professional ease, spent an hour inside, then left empty-handed. We called the police, but without theft or damage, there wasn't much they could do. Nathaniel suspected it might be connected to Bertha's associates, people worried about what evidence we might have. That night, we stayed in a hotel. The violation of our home, the place where we were building our future, hit harder than all of Bertha's financial demands. She was in jail, but her poison was still spreading. Maria held her belly protectively, and I promised her and our unborn child that I'd keep them safe. The next morning, the mysterious woman appeared at Nathaniel's office. She introduced herself as Carla, another of Bertha's former associates from the hospital. She'd come looking for specific documents, she admitted, evidence of her own involvement that Bethany had mentioned we might have. She was terrified of being implicated. Carla offered information in exchange for keeping her name out of the investigation. She knew where Bertha kept her real records, not the sanitized versions she'd shown Dad, but the true accounting of her crimes. There was a storage unit Bertha had maintained for years, paid for in cash, where she kept her trophies and documentation. We got a warrant for the storage unit. What we found inside was horrifying. Boxes of patient files, each marked with how much Bertha had gained from their deaths, jewelry and personal items she'd taken as mementos, detailed notes about substance dosages and forged signatures. It was the archive of a serial killer who happened to use paperwork instead of violence. Among the boxes, I found a file with my mother's name. Inside were photos of her in the hospital, growing weaker, notes in Bertha's handwriting about increasing dosages, and at the bottom, a photo of Bertha at my parents' wedding, smiling beside my father. She'd kept it like a trophy. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor said it was one of the most extensive cases of medical serial killing they'd seen. The hospital faced massive lawsuits. New regulations were being drafted. Bertha's name would become synonymous with a particular kind of evil, the caregiver who kills for profit. Throughout all this, Dad continued his downward spiral. He'd been arrested for public intoxication, lost his job, been kicked out by his brother. The last I heard, he was living in his car. The man who'd enabled Bertha's evil through his indifference was now facing his own consequences. Alexandra gave birth to Sarah on a rainy Tuesday. Despite everything, I went to the hospital. This innocent child was my sister, connected to me through no fault of her own. Alexandra was grateful for my presence. She'd grown up a lot through this ordeal, was determined to be a good mother despite the circumstances. As I held Sarah for the first time, I thought about cycles. Bertha had broken the cycle of love my mother had started, replacing it with transaction and greed. Dad had continued it through neglect and selfishness. But here was a chance to start fresh. This little girl would know she was valued for herself, not her potential earnings. The trial date was set. Bertha would face justice for multiple murders, fraud, and conspiracy. The other families and I would testify. It would be painful, reliving those losses, but necessary. My mother and the others deserved to have their stories told, their deaths acknowledged as murders rather than natural tragedies. In preparation, I went through more of my mother's things. I found her journal from her healthy years, full of hopes for my future. She'd written about wanting me to find love, have children, build a life of meaning. Simple wishes that Bertha had nearly destroyed with her greed, but Bertha had failed. Here I was, married, expecting a child, building exactly the life my mother had wished for me. The investigation continued to ripple outward. Other hospitals began reviewing suspicious deaths. Families who'd accepted beneficiary changes started asking questions. Bertha's methods were being studied to prevent future occurrences. Out of tragedy was coming reform, though it felt like too little too late. Maria and I decided to move. Our house felt tainted after the break-in. We found a new place closer to her parents, with a yard for our future child to play in. As we packed, I made a decision. All the documents, the evidence, the reminders of Bertha's crimes, I would hand them all over to the authorities. I didn't need to hold on to that poison. The only things I kept were my mother's letters and photos. The rest could burn for all I cared. This new house would be about the future, not the past. About love, not transaction. About the family we were building, not the one that had tried to destroy me. A week before the trial, Bertha tried one last manipulation. She sent a letter through her lawyer claiming she had information about my mother's final words, messages my mother had asked her to pass on. It was an obvious ploy, but it worked. Despite myself, I needed to know. I met with her in prison, Nathaniel beside me. Bertha looked smaller in her orange jumpsuit, older, but her eyes still held that calculating gleam. She spun a story about my mother's gratitude for Bertha's care, about how my mother had wanted Bertha to guide me. Lies, all of it, but delivered with such conviction that for a moment, I almost believed. Then she made her mistake. She mentioned a detail about my mother's room that was wrong. The color of the walls, the view from the window. I'd visited that room. I knew she was lying. When I called her on it, her mask finally slipped. The real Bertha emerged, venomous and bitter, admitting she'd enjoyed watching my mother fade, enjoyed taking what should have been mine. I left that meeting feeling oddly freed. The last hold Bertha had on me, The possibility that she'd shared genuine moments with my mother was broken. She was exactly what she'd always been, a parasite who fed on others' lives and loves. My mother had died without knowing the monster beside her bed, which was perhaps a mercy. The trial began on a cold Monday. The courthouse was packed with families Bertha had destroyed. We sat together, a united front against evil. When Bertha entered in shackles, there was no satisfaction in seeing her brought low, just sadness for all the lives she'd stolen, all the final moments she'd poisoned. My testimony came on the third day. I spoke about my mother, about the woman who'd loved unconditionally versus the woman who'd made love transactional. I showed the jury the investment tracker, explained how Bertha had turned childhood into a business arrangement. I watched several jurors wipe away tears. The other families testified too. Story after story of trust betrayed, of final days stolen, of inheritances redirected. The prosecution presented the evidence from the storage unit, the medical records, the forged documents. Bertha's own meticulous record-keeping became her downfall. Bertha's defense was pathetic. She claimed mental illness, addiction, manipulation by others. She tried to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, but the evidence was too overwhelming, her crimes too calculated. Even her lawyer seemed to be going through the motions. During a break, I encountered Dad outside the courthouse. He looked like a ghost of himself, thin and hollow-eyed. He tried to approach, but court security stopped him. He called out that he was sorry, that he'd been weak, that he'd failed me. I kept walking. Some apologies come too late. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. Bertha would spend the rest of her life in prison, no possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, she stared at me with those cold eyes. Even then, I think she was calculating, wondering if there was some angle she'd missed, some way to still profit from my existence. After the trial, the families gathered at a quiet restaurant. We raised a toast to our lost loved ones, to justice served, to moving forward. It wasn't celebration, how could it be? But it was closure. We'd faced evil and seen it punished. Our loved ones could rest peacefully. Maria and I went home to our new house. The nursery was almost ready. We'd painted it the soft yellow my mother had loved. On the wall hung a photo of her holding me as a baby, her face full of the kind of love Bertha could never understand or fake. Our child would know their grandmother through stories of her kindness, not the cruelty that followed. That night, I burned the investment tracker in our fireplace. Maria held my hand as we watched it turn to ash. The twisted system that had defined my childhood was finally gone. In its place, we were building something better. A family based on love, not points, on connection, not profit. The next morning brought unexpected news. The hospital, facing massive lawsuits, had agreed to a settlement that included funding a foundation in the victims' names. It would provide support for families dealing with medical loss, ensuring no one else would be as vulnerable as our loved ones had been. My mother's name would live on, attached to something good. I was asked to speak at the foundation's launch. Standing before a crowd of medical professionals, administrators, and families, I talked about the importance of oversight, of protecting the vulnerable, of never letting efficiency override humanity. I spoke about my mother's kindness and how it had survived even Bertha's attempts to monetize it. Dad attempted to attend the event but was turned away. He'd written to the foundation, trying to claim credit for exposing Bertha, rewriting history to make himself a hero. No one believed him. He'd become a cautionary tale himself, the enabler who'd looked away while evil flourished in his home. As my due date approached, I found myself thinking about the future. Our child would never know the weight of being seen as an investment. They'd never have to earn basic affection through achievements. They'd be loved simply for existing, the way my mother had loved me, the way Bertha had never understood. The other families stayed in touch. We had an odd bond, forged in shared tragedy. Some were still struggling with the revelations about their loved ones' deaths. Others had found peace in finally knowing the truth. We supported each other through the aftermath, understanding in ways others couldn't. One family, the Johnsons, discovered their father had left them a letter similar to my mother's, hidden away, full of love, untouched by Bertha's poison. Reading it at our support group meeting, they wept. Even in his final days, drugged and manipulated, he'd managed to leave them truth. Bertha had stolen his life, but not his love. The ripple effects continued. Nurses who'd worked with Bertha came forward with suspicions they'd been too afraid to voice. Administrators admitted to ignoring warning signs. The hospital implemented new systems, better oversight, mandatory reporting. It wouldn't bring back the dead, but it might save future victims. Through it all, Maria remained my anchor. She'd researched evil to help me find justice. Now she researched joy, baby names, parenting techniques, nursery designs. She was determined that our child's story would be different, that Bertha's shadow wouldn't touch this new life. Her strength amazed me daily. As I write this, Maria is in the early stages of labor. Soon, our child will enter a world where their grandmother's killer is behind bars, where their grandfather is a cautionary tale, but where they are surrounded by intentional love. The cycle Bertha tried to perpetuate ends here. I've kept my mother's letters in a special box for when our child is older. They'll know their grandmother through her words of unconditional love. They'll understand that some things can't be bought or earned or calculated. Some things, the most important things, are freely given. The investment tracker is ash. The manipulators are facing consequences. Love in our house flows freely. No points required. My mother's love won in the end, just as she always believed it would. It just took longer than any of us imagined. I need to continue from where the middle section ended, with Maria in early labor. I'll maintain 97% action events until approximately word 1697, then provide a brief action-based resolution. The contractions started coming faster. Maria gripped my hand as we rushed to the hospital, her breathing controlled despite the pain. The same hospital where my mother had died, where Bertha had orchestrated her schemes. Now it would witness new life. In the delivery room, Maria pushed through hours of labor. Between contractions, she reminded me of the names we'd chosen. The nurses were efficient, professional, nothing like the corrupted staff from Bertha's era. The new oversight protocols were evident everywhere. Multiple staff checking medications, witnesses for every document signed. Our daughter arrived at 3:47 a.m. Eleanor. She had my mother's eyes, the same gentle brown that had looked at me with unconditional love. The nurse placed her on Maria's chest, and I watched my wife become a mother, saw the fierce protective love bloom instantly. The next morning, while Maria slept, I held Eleanor and walked to the window. Below, I spotted a familiar figure in the parking lot. Dad, thinner than ever, pacing beside a rusted sedan. He must have heard about the birth somehow. Security had already been alerted. He wasn't allowed in the building. I watched him for 20 minutes. He never looked up, just paced and smoked, occasionally wiping his face. Part of me wondered what he was thinking, whether he understood he'd never meet his granddaughter. Then Eleanor stirred in my arms, and I turned away. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Alexandra visited that afternoon with Sarah, now 6 months old. The half-sisters met for the first time, Sarah reaching out with chubby fingers to touch Eleanor's face. Alexandra had transformed since the trial, working as a medical receptionist, taking night classes, building a stable life for her daughter. She told me Dad had been calling her too, begging for money, making promises about getting clean. She'd changed her number twice, but he kept finding ways to contact her. The man who'd once dreamed of living off my success was now homeless, bouncing between shelters in his car. That evening, Nathaniel called with news. Bertha had filed an appeal, claiming ineffective counsel. It was a long shot. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but she'd found a lawyer willing to take the case. Even from prison, she was still scheming, still calculating angles. The appeal documents arrived the next week. Bertha was claiming the prosecution had hidden evidence, that witnesses had been coerced, that her mental state hadn't been properly evaluated. Reading through her arguments, I recognized the same manipulative patterns, twisting facts, playing victim, searching for any crack in the system she could exploit. We were home with Eleanor when the private investigator I'd hired months ago called with a final report. He'd been tracking down loose ends from Bertha's schemes. He'd found something disturbing, a safety deposit box Bertha had maintained under a false name. Inside were documents related to other potential victims, insurance policies she'd researched, medical files she'd copied, forged signatures she'd been practicing. The dates showed she'd been planning new schemes right up until her arrest. Even while demanding money from me, she'd been identifying her next targets. One file particularly chilled me. It contained information about Maria's parents, their insurance policies, their medical histories. Bertha had been researching them, possibly planning to expand her operations to include my future in-laws. The woman's evil had no boundaries. We turned everything over to prosecutors. It would strengthen their case against the appeal, show Bertha's ongoing criminal intent. But it also meant more families learning they'd been targeted, more people discovering how close they'd come to being victims. The foundation's first grant recipients were announced. Families who'd lost loved ones to medical negligence or fraud would receive support. My mother's name was listed among the founding donors. Her legacy transformed from victim to protector. It was a small victory against the darkness Bertha had spread. Eleanor was 3 weeks old when we received an unexpected package. No return address, but I recognized Dad's handwriting. Inside was a wooden toy, a hand-carved rocking horse. A note explained he'd been learning woodworking at the shelter, that this was his first completed project. I studied the toy carefully. It was rough but sturdy, clearly made with effort if not skill. The note said he understood if I threw it away, but he'd wanted to make something with his own hands for his granddaughter. It was the first thing he'd ever created instead of schemed to take. Maria found me sitting with the toy, conflicted. She took it gently, examined it, then placed it on Eleanor's shelf. Not prominently displayed, but not discarded either. A reminder that even broken people could attempt creation instead of destruction, even if it came too late for forgiveness. The Nguyen family contacted me about Patricia. She'd been struggling since the trial, unable to move past her grandmother's murder. They wondered if talking to someone else who'd lost a parent to Bertha might help. I agreed to meet her. Patricia looked haunted when we met at a quiet cafe. She'd been going through her grandmother's things, finding more evidence of Bertha's manipulation. Her grandmother had written about the kind hospital worker who brought special tea, who sat with her when family couldn't visit. The trust Bertha had exploited tormented Patricia. I shared my mother's letters, showed her how my mother had written similar things about Bertha. We talked about how predators like Bertha specifically chose kind, trusting people. How our loved one's capacity for trust wasn't a weakness, but a strength Bertha had perverted. Patricia cried, but something in her posture eased. She started coming to our informal support group. The families Bertha had destroyed found comfort in shared understanding. We didn't follow any formal structure, just met monthly to talk, to remember our loved ones, to ensure their deaths meant something beyond Bertha's greed. Eleanor was 2 months old when Bertha's appeal was denied. The judge's decision was scathing, calling her crimes calculated evil hidden behind a facade of care. Bertha would serve her full sentence. No parole, no early release, no legal manipulation could free her. That night, I found one of Bertha's letters that had slipped behind my desk, one I'd never opened. Against my better judgment, I read it. It was exactly what I'd expected. Manipulation disguised as remorse, calculations dressed as apology. She still referred to me as her investment and claimed credit for my success. I fed it to the shredder, watching her words turn to confetti. Eleanor was crying, and I went to comfort her, leaving Bertha's manipulation in pieces where it belonged. My daughter would never know that twisted love, never have her worth calculated on a chart. The foundation grew. Other hospitals adopted our protocols. Families shared their stories, pushing for stronger oversight. What Bertha had done in darkness was forcing systemic change. It wouldn't resurrect the dead, but it might prevent future predators from operating so freely. Maria returned to work part-time, bringing Eleanor to the office nursery. Watching her balance motherhood and career, I thought about Bertha's twisted view of success. She'd seen only monetary value, missing the richness of a life built on genuine connections and meaningful work. One morning, security called from my office building. Dad was in the lobby, sober, but desperate. He'd been evicted from the shelter for fighting, had nowhere else to turn. Security could remove him, or I could come down. I chose to face him one last time. He looked skeletal, aged decades in months. He didn't ask for money this time, just wanted to know if I'd kept the rocking horse. When I nodded, something in his face shifted. He pulled out a small wooden box, another creation from the shelter workshop. Inside were carved letters spelling Eleanor's name. I took the box but made things clear. These gifts didn't change anything. He'd enabled a murderer, schemed to exploit me, chosen greed over family. He nodded, understanding. As security escorted him out, he didn't look back. It was the last time I saw him. The storage unit where we'd found Bertha's trophies was being cleaned out. Among the items was that photo of Bertha at my parents' wedding, smiling beside my father. I stared at it, trying to see signs of the monster she'd become. But she looked normal, even kind. Evil didn't always announce itself. I brought the photo to our support group. Others had similar pictures. Bertha at hospital events, charity functions, family gatherings. We decided to create a warning display for the foundation, showing how predators could hide in plain sight. Bertha's smiling face would serve as a cautionary tale. Eleanor started sleeping through the night at 4 months. Those quiet hours, I'd sometimes read my mother's letters aloud to her. She couldn't understand the words yet, but I wanted her to know her grandmother's voice through mine, to feel the love that had survived Bertha's attempts to destroy it. The hospital where my mother died was renovating the oncology ward. They asked if I'd like to contribute to a memorial wall for patients who died there. I donated a plaque with my mother's name and her favorite quote, "Love multiplies when divided." Bertha had tried to divide and subtract. My mother's philosophy had won. Alexandra got engaged to a pediatric nurse she'd met at work. She asked if I'd walk her down the aisle since Sarah's father couldn't. It was strange being thrust into that role, but Sarah deserved stability. At the wedding, she toddled between guests, unaware of the darkness that had brought her into existence. The other families from our group attended too. We'd become an unlikely extended family, bonded by shared loss and Bertha's evil. Watching Alexandra and her new husband dance, seeing Sarah laugh with the other children, I realized Bertha had failed in her ultimate goal. She'd tried to reduce everything to transactions, but we'd built something she couldn't understand: genuine community. Eleanor took her first steps in the same week Bertha's lawyer filed another appeal, this time claiming prosecutorial misconduct. The timing felt cosmic, my daughter moving forward while Bertha remained trapped in her schemes. The appeal was dismissed within days. Even her lawyer seemed to be going through the motions now. I'd been documenting our story, thinking it might help other families recognize the signs of exploitation. Maria supported the idea, but worried about privacy. We decided to write it anonymously, focusing on the patterns of abuse rather than personal details. The publisher was interested, seeing value in exposing how predators operated within helping professions. Dad's obituary appeared in the paper 6 months after Eleanor's birth. He died at a homeless shelter from complications of alcoholism. The shelter director called, said he'd been carrying a photo of Eleanor from a news article about the foundation. Even in his final days, he'd held on to some connection to the family he'd destroyed. I didn't attend the funeral, but I sent flowers. The card read simply, "For Eleanor's grandfather." It was more kindness than he'd earned, but less than a daughter deserved to give. Alexandra attended with Sarah. She said only a handful of people came. His brother, a few shelter residents, the woodworking teacher who'd helped him make those gifts. Bertha must have heard about Dad's death. She sent another letter, this time trying to claim widows' rights to my support. The manipulation was almost laughable now. She was serving life for murdering my mother, among others, yet still believed she could extract money from me. The letter went straight to the shredder. Eleanor's first birthday approached. We planned a small celebration. Maria's parents, our closest friends, some families from the support group. No grand gestures, no calculations of gift values, just people who loved her gathering to mark her first year of life. The morning of her party, I found myself at my mother's grave with Eleanor. I told my mother about her granddaughter, about the life we'd built despite Bertha's poison. Eleanor babbled and reached for the flowers, and I imagined my mother's smile. Love had multiplied when divided, just as she'd believed. The party was perfect in its simplicity. Eleanor smashed her cake with enthusiasm, getting frosting in her hair. The Nguyens brought their new grandson. The Johnsons came with their teenage daughter who'd started pre-med, inspired to help prevent medical exploitation. Patricia brought homemade spring rolls, her grandmother's recipe. That night, after everyone left and Eleanor slept, Maria and I cleaned up together. No charts on our refrigerator, no point systems, no calculations of worth. Just the normal chaos of a 1-year-old's birthday. The life my mother had wanted for me, finally achieved. The book about recognizing medical predators was published quietly. We donated all proceeds to the foundation. It would never be a bestseller, but it might help someone recognize the signs, might prevent another Bertha from operating unchecked. My mother's death had meaning beyond Bertha's greed. Eleanor started talking early. Her first word was mama, her second, dada. Normal childhood milestones that Bertha would have tried to monetize. We celebrated each word, each step, each discovery for what it was. Our daughter growing and learning, not increasing her earning potential. 2 years after the trial, the hospital completed its renovation. The new oncology ward had multiple oversight systems, mandatory reporting protocols, and family advocacy programs. A small plaque acknowledged the victims of past failures. My mother's name was there, along with the others Bertha had called. I spoke at the dedication ceremony. Eleanor, now walking confidently, played at Maria's feet while I talked about the importance of vigilance, of protecting the vulnerable, of never letting efficiency override humanity. Several nurses approached afterward, sharing how the new protocols had already prevented suspicious situations. Bertha tried one final manipulation from prison. She claimed to have found religion, wanted to apologize to her victims' families, needed us to forgive her for her own salvation. The prison chaplain contacted us, genuinely believing in her conversion. We declined the meeting. Some performances didn't deserve an audience. As Eleanor grew, we told her age-appropriate truths about her grandmother. She knew Grandma Eleanor had been sick, that bad people had hurt her, but that her love lived on through stories and letters. We'd share more when she was older, but for now, she knew she was named after someone who loved unconditionally. The support group evolved into an official nonprofit, advocating for patient rights and family oversight. What had started as shared grief became a force for change. We lobbied for legislation, funded research into medical exploitation, provided resources for families navigating suspicious circumstances. On Eleanor's 3rd birthday, we received word that Bertha had died in prison. A stroke, the official said. Natural causes. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The woman who'd hastened deaths for profit had died of the kind of sudden illness she'd once mimicked in her victims. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no grief, no closure. Bertha had been gone from our lives since her conviction. Her physical death changed nothing.